For those who find tranquility in the meticulous, we begin our study not in the halls of power, but in the humid, mosquito-ridden woodlands of what was then a largely undeveloped region between the Commonwealth of Virginia and the state of Maryland. The year was 1791, and the foundational task for the future of the American Republic, the precise geometric definition of the federal district, was underway. This responsibility fell primarily to Major Andrew Ellicott, a Pennsylvania-born surveyor, who was assisted by the remarkable self-taught astronomer and mathematician Benjamin Banneker. The goal, decreed by the Residence Act of 1790, was to establish a square of territory, 10 miles on a side, encompassing exactly 100 square miles. To execute this, Ellicott and his team relied upon instruments of utmost precision for the era. Their workhorse was the surveyor's transit, a heavy, brass instrument mounted on a tripod, utilizing a magnetic compass and an optical sight to establish true bearings. Measurement of distance was achieved not with tape, but with the Gunter's chain, a 50-foot assembly of 100 iron links, each carefully calibrated. The combination of these tools, while mathematically sound, demanded painstaking, repetitive labor, perfectly suited to the kind of detail we shall explore. The boundary was not to be a theoretical scribble on a map. It was to be a tangible demarcation on the earth itself. Ellicott's method involved establishing a cardinal point, the south corner, near present-day Alexandria, and then tracing the boundary lines northeast and northwest from that origin. The first step was the tedious process of running the line, where axemen cleared narrow avenues through the dense trees, allowing the surveyors a clear line of sight, while chainmen measured the distances link by painstaking link. The intention was to mark the corners and the boundary at intervals of precisely 1 mile, with boundary stones meticulously inscribed with the year, the initials of the states involved, MD or VA, and the designation of the mile number. Yet despite this dedication to precision, the enormous challenge of surveying 100 square miles of rugged, uneven terrain inevitably invited error. The most critical omission, the seed of the Great Quibble, occurred somewhere along the southwestern boundary line, a stretch of territory that bordered Virginia. While the north corner, the east corner, and the west corner were eventually set with a reasonable degree of confidence, the south corner's exact placement and its surrounding mile markers became disturbingly ambiguous. Historical records indicate that the official surveyor's journals, while documenting the precise magnetic variation and chain measurements for every other segment, contained conflicting or outright missing data for a short but crucial portion near the Potomac River. It is this small, unconfirmed stretch, perhaps only a few hundred yards of unmarked land in 1791, that would later swell into a legal headache for the nascent government. In the grand scope of American history, this was a matter of a few misplaced stones. Yet in the history of cartography and governance, an unmarked survey line, even a short one, represents an existential vacuum. It was an oversight that by the turn of the century would threaten the very geometric integrity of the District of Columbia and provoke a constitutional argument over where exactly the nation's capital legally resided.
The error of omission, a mere smudge in the meticulously kept field notes of Andrew Ellicott's team, did not immediately erupt into national scandal. Instead, it festered slowly, a low-grade legal infection in the body of the new federal district. By the turn of the century, as government operations gradually moved from Philadelphia to the banks of the Potomac, the ambiguity surrounding the unmarked mile marker evolved from a surveyor's technical problem into a full-blown political and economic dilemma. The specific area of contention centered on the precise location of the boundary between the Virginia portion and the Maryland portion of the district, particularly where the lines intersected with property deeds that predated the federal acquisition. The crisis manifested not through public protest, but through dry, densely worded legislative documents. Letters exchanged between President George Washington and later John Adams and the appointed commissioners of the federal district reveal a growing anxiety over the exact boundaries of federal jurisdiction. Land speculators and landowners in the area of Alexandria, Virginia, began to raise questions. If the precise southwest corner of the 10-mile square could not be definitively certified by a single undisputed monument, did their land truly fall under the laws of the federal district, or did it remain subject to the statutes of the Commonwealth of Virginia? This distinction was far from academic. It involved taxation, legal jurisdiction, and, critically, the right of the federal government to condemn and purchase land for infrastructural development. To compound the issue, the stones that were placed were subject to the elements and occasional human interference. Historical records show that several stones, intended to be durable markers of Aquia Creek sandstone, a material specifically chosen for its longevity, were either vandalized, shifted by natural erosion, or simply swallowed by the relentless encroachment of the forest. The commissioners, tasked with managing the burgeoning capital, thus found themselves spending a disproportionate amount of time on the dreary task of boundary maintenance rather than on the more pressing matters of construction. They initiated several costly, small-scale resurveys, each of which produced slightly different findings, further muddying the cartographic waters. The most profound element of the crisis lay in the fear of legislative invalidity. If a constitutional challenge were ever mounted asserting that the District of Columbia was not a perfect square of 10 miles on a side, as stipulated by the Residence Act, the very legality of placing the seat of government there could be questioned. Could a few feet of unconfirmed boundary void an act of Congress? This quiet constitutional threat formed the backdrop to a decade of tedious committee meetings and legislative arguments. The dispute required the attention of some of the nation's foremost legal minds, who were compelled to debate the fine points of metes and bounds versus geometric perfection, often resulting in debates so detailed and tiresome
The tedious cartographic quibble reached its legislative climax, not in a sudden dramatic confrontation, but after decades of exhausted deliberation. The core problem, the failure to definitively mark the southwest corner of the District of Columbia in 1791, had become inextricably linked to the practical governance of the area south of the Potomac River, known as Alexandria County. This region, originally ceded by Virginia, felt increasingly disconnected from the federal enterprise developing on the Maryland side. Local citizens complained of high federal taxes, a lack of self-governance, and the distinct lack of investment in infrastructure compared to Washington City itself. This political disquiet, combined with the underlying ambiguity of the original survey lines, to produce a peculiar phenomenon known as retrocession. Driven by the desire of Alexandria residents to return to the jurisdiction of Virginia, and prompted by the lingering cartographic doubt, Congress began to consider relinquishing the land it had originally accepted. The historical irony is palpable. The very uncertainty created by a few hundred miles of unconfirmed survey line provided the political justification to entirely divest the nation's capital of nearly a third of its original territory. The final act occurred in 1846. The legislative process was predictably long and densely technical, involving arguments over old state charters, the meaning of perfect square in the Residence Act, and the precise measurements of the land to be returned. The key piece of legislation was the Act of July 9, 1846, which authorized the return of Alexandria County back to the Commonwealth of Virginia.
This decision was contingent upon a favorable vote from the residents of the area, a vote that was duly held and passed, cementing the divorce. The implementation of the retrocession involved a final, meticulous, and frankly exhausting recalibration of the boundary. Surveyors were once again dispatched, this time to define a new permanent border along the Potomac River. They were tasked with using the still extant but now revised markers to establish the current boundaries of the District of Columbia, permanently severing the 10-mile square concept into a modified, less symmetrical shape. The result was not a heroic clean fix, but a bureaucratic modification. The district shrank from 100 square miles to approximately 68 square miles. The original south corner stone, whose ambiguous placement began the trouble, was rendered historically interesting but geographically obsolete for the purposes of federal jurisdiction. And thus, the Great Cartographic Quibble was resolved not by finding the missing marker, but by eliminating the need for it. The story serves as a fascinating footnote on the foundation of the capital, a lengthy, quiet crisis caused by a few hundred yards of unconfirmed survey line, corrected over 50 years later by a political decision that was more about local taxation and representation than geometry, ultimately reducing the size of the capital to what it is today. A quiet end to a quiet crisis, perfect for drifting off to sleep.